welcome everybody, and ask that before you leave, if you haven't already, to just sign in. We have some newsletters that came out a few weeks ago, some of the flyers for upcoming events. My name is Jennifer Solomon. I'm the assistant to the director of the Israeli Institute of Israel Studies. At the moment, the director is actually on Skype in Jerusalem, and he's asked me to read an introduction for today. So pretend I'm him for a second. His name is Professor Csaba Nikoleni. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is perhaps fitting that as director of the Israeli Institute of Israel Studies, I should welcome you on today's occasion from Israel. To be specific, from Jerusalem, where the weather is unusually cold, rainy, and what do you know, snowy as well. But please, no mercy. The snow and the winter of Jerusalem are still quite a bit more gentle than what we normally have in Montreal, and what we saw last week paralyzed the Northeast United States. Today's talk marks the beginning of yet another eventful semester at the Institute, with lots of exciting talks, seminars, and special events. We are delighted that you are able to join us today, and certainly hope that you will keep coming back to learn more about the state of Israel studies and engage our visiting and in-house researchers about the questions and problems they probe. Today's talk in particularly special because we are launching a brand new book published by Dr. Ilan Danjoux, who has joined the Institute as an affiliated scholar this academic year. Although Dr. Danjoux is a young scholar, he already has a lot of accomplishments to his credit. After receiving his doctorate from the University of Manchester, he did his postdoctoral research at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and was a visiting professor of Israel Studies at the University of Calgary, where he was awarded the Teaching Excellence Award for his course on the history of Zionism and the Israeli-Arab conflict. His work focuses on the visual securitization and emotional politics of political cartoons. He has used Israeli and Palestinian cartoons to understand their ability to anticipate the outbreak of the Second Intifada, derail the Oslo peace process, explain terrorism, and predict election results. Since completing his PhD, Dr. Danjoux has authored one single-authored book, Political Cartoons and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, published in 2015 by Manchester University Press, and a number of articles in both scholarly and popular outlets, including Political Science and Politics, the Israel Journal of International Affairs, Yedioth Ahronot, to mention but a few. The Israeli Institute of Israel Studies is delighted to host the launching of this most recent publication in the field of Israel Studies by a young Canadian scholar. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ilan Danjoux.
First, I want to thank you for coming out to today's talk. There are some seats here. I was told to warn you that if you're sitting here, you might be on camera. So you might be on camera if that's okay with you. My talk and sort of my research focuses on political cartoons, and I'll explain sort of in the talk partly how I stumbled into it. And my book has gone soft cover, and it's on basically the political cartoons in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What I'd like to do today is discuss a little bit of cartoons matter, why cartoons matter, or basically how they matter. Why look at cartoons? Do cartoons predict violence, which is the focus of this book particularly? And present some findings, which there are more findings in there. We have my publisher's given 20% discount on any books that are purchased, so we have there's an online purchase form there, so you can pick that up if you like as well. The first thing I'd like to talk about sort of is the idea that cartoons matter. And I used to have to justify that cartoons matter, cartoons are important, cartoons make news or newsworthy or research worthy. But even if I look at this the past 2 weeks, there's already, cartoons have often become the topic of news as opposed to reporters of news or sort of chronicles of news events. And we have Iran launching another cartoon, Holocaust cartoon contest. Charlie Hebdo came out with a newly offensive cartoon which depicts Alan Kurdi as a potential pedophile. And then there's anti-Semitic cartoons, which is an apology for anti-Semitic cartoons that are published. And this all happened in the past 2 weeks. The issue is that cartoons matter, and sort of how do you know cartoons matter? The amount of effort taken to silence cartoons and the attempt to keep cartoons or to stop cartoonists from doing their art is an important indicator. And cartoons, or attempts to silence cartoons, it's got quite a history. You've got Aristotle and Aristophanes talk about the silencing of ancient Greek cartoonists mocking political leaders. You have King Louis Philippe of France wanting to silence the cartoons or negative cartoons of himself. In Pennsylvania, they actually outlawed political cartoons in 1903. They tried to outlaw it because they said you can't depict a person as an animal, and then people started depicting them as inanimate objects. And so they tried to outlaw it. It didn't work. The Gestapo, or not, Hitler put English cartoonist David Lowe on the extermination list because he didn't like the way he was being depicted in English cartoons. Paul Conner was placed on Nixon's enemy list. Yitzhak Rabin canceled description of Davar because he didn't like the cartoon or how he was depicted. The PLO murdered Naji Ali for cartoons that negatively depicted the PLO. Boss Tweed, sort of famous, sort of a common quote we often say is, Boss Tweed says, my constituents can't read, so I don't care what you publish about me, but stop those pictures, or stop those damn pictures because they can see. More recently, you've got Syrian cartoonist Ali Farzad, who was beaten up or roughed up, beaten up, his hand broken for cartoons against the Syrian regime. He did this cartoon in retaliation for being put in the hospital. You've got Libyan cartoonists being killed, or he was killed for negative depictions of Gaddafi. You've got a lot of those other ones were the state or a government trying to silence cartoonists, but now you actually have you have the Danish Cartoon controversy, where you have boycotts or violence following cartoons. Obviously, Charlie Hebdo as well. And so the notion is that cartoons actually matter, and there's a lot of effort taken to silence cartoons or cartoonists. But people don't often try to, the important part isn't just the attempt to silence them. There's also the idea that they may be used for something. So Gillian's Poston, who did the actual, the Danish cartoon controversy, used cartoons to actually prove a point or try to be provocative. Iran has launched several, in retaliation to this, they perceived that this was, there's a permissiveness to draw Muhammad in Western India. Iran has launched Holocaust cartoon contests to say, well, we can draw cartoon contests as well, and let's see if you get offended by this. In retaliation to that, there's an Israeli anti-Semitic cartoon contest, which was actually set up by Israelis to say, well, we can draw anti-Semitic cartoons better than you can draw anti-Semitic cartoons. And so cartoons are actually deployed or used as cartooning for peace. And this goes back, you have cartoons that were used, dropped over Nazi Germany to try to turn the population against the leaders. And you have, when the Soviet Union was attacked, you actually had cartoons, a book of cartoons published from the British to actually show that the Soviets were on the British side or anti-Nazi because they used cartoons as evidence of something. So cartoons have actually been used to deploy the art, and I keep getting in the way of the screen, so I'll try to stand back. And there's also, if nothing else, people monitor cartoons. People care how groups they're being depicted in cartoons. You've got groups like Palestinian Media Watch, you've got Memory that actually look at, sort of monitor cartoons, say, well, look what's going on, look how we're being depicted in cartoons. You have, this is a very interesting cartoon I stumbled upon. This is actually in the Hamas newspaper, Philistine, and this is actually an Israeli cartoon that was translated, but it's originally an Israeli cartoon to show the effectiveness of the missiles on Israeli population, because Israelis, it hit the Israeli population, so it was actually used as evidence that the missiles were working. You have sort of from the 60s, you've got CIA chief used to actually, when he was stationed in Jerusalem, used to actually read the cartoons to get a sense of what's going on in the world, or going on the ground. So the idea that cartoons matter, I think is important. The question is, why do they matter? And a lot of the reason why they matter, and I know I put some of the wording down here because I didn't expect it to be such a big screen, but the chronicle, so there's a sense that they chronicle violence, they actually monitor violence. And early days, sort of in the 60s, there's a sense that the number of cartoons is a good indicator of how conflictual an era is. If cartoons sort of associated with political violence or political conflict, there's a sense that the number of cartoons. And I actually dismissed that a little because I said, well, when cartoons are expensive to make, the more you spend on them, the more time you spend on them, will indicate that they're worthwhile something. Then you had the Arab Spring happen, And then you actually had an explosion of cartoons that actually followed and were during the Arab Spring. You have the Benghazi rebel headquarters, I guess, it's sort of, and they were actually littered with political cartoons on the actual walls. You had cartoon showcases or exhibits that followed Tahrir Square, and cartoons actually were part of this, and there was an increase in number of overall cartoons. But often what bugs people isn't actually the number of cartoons, is actually the way people are depicted in cartoons, which also suggests, and sort of people get a sense of maybe cartoons don't just chronicle events, maybe they incite things. And this is actually where a lot of people get bothered by, they say, well, a cartoon might incite people to do things or have some sort of influence. And there is anecdotal evidence for this. This is a cartoon that was published. Paul Revere sort of spread this around, and this is argued this is a precursor to the American Revolution. Use this cartoon, look at the massacre that's happening, we need a revolution, and the American Revolution kicks off. The violence in Syria, or the civil war in Syria, arguably people say there's actually there's cartoon images or cartoons that are being drawn on walls that actually help trigger and start this violence. And so the notion that, you know, the imminence of war, or the imminence of violence, I would say, can be anticipated by the depiction or certain depictions of violence, is actually quite, there's some good evidence for it, or sort of suggestions for it. Anti-Semitic cartoons prior to the Holocaust. This is actually one sort of, you go to any sort of Holocaust museum, you'll see that, look at the cartoons, you could have seen the violence coming. This is actually anti-Tutsi cartoons published. This is actually a year before the genocide took place, of Tutsis raping, killing, and eating Hutus, and then the genocide comes, and this idea that does this incite violence, and cartoons do it. So, and it kind of explains why you would be so bothered if cartoons are depicting your group or your community if you think they incite violence. Which leads me to where the book sort of begins, is the Danish Cartoon controversy. And the Danish Cartoon controversy is interesting because there's some unusual things for it. First off, if you look at the cartoon contest, if you know about this, was basically there's an allegation that no one, it was difficult to find anybody willing to draw Muhammad in a children's book, and so a children's person took it upon themselves to have a competition.
Sorry. Just about the Rwandan cartoons.
Yes.
You know, the genocide was anti-Tutsi, but those cartoons were anti-Hutus?
No, anti-Tutsi.
Okay.
There were Tutsis killing, raping Hutus. So the cartoon was actually accusing Tutsis of being violent. So and it was a precursor to the genocide.
Fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. And let me know if I'm going too fast, or sort of I can raise your hand, so I'll try to deal with any issues or questions. The 12 cartoons, so there's a cartoon contest that was done in Denmark. The 12 cartoons, if you actually look at the 12 cartoons that were published, not all the cartoons were actually offensive. If you look at it, this is actually one of the cartoons that was there, and the cartoon said, "Draw Mohammed." And this is actually one of the cartoonists actually drew a boy named Mohammed, and on the wall is actually written that the journalists of Children's Post are a bunch of reactionary provocateurs. So not every cartoon in the actual bunch or in the contest were offensive. Not every offensive image were published. So there's actually a report that was published after the cartoon contest, and there are some fake, this is actually, this was alleged to be a cartoon in the actual series, which it wasn't. It's actually a picture of this guy Jacques Barrault who's participating in a pig squealing contest for whatever reason. But it was used to say, well, this is also a cartoon in there. And there were the offensive cartoons that were published without reprimand. So some of these cartoons that were offensive were published in Egyptian papers, Saudi papers, with actually sort of sometimes a caveat saying, this is informative and this is actually what's going on, this is actually newsworthy, rather than being provocative. There's also the most intense reaction took place outside of Denmark, and there's a 3-month delay on it. And perhaps more importantly, this did not precede an anti-Islamic genocide or violence or outrage or pogrom that happened. So the question really sort of that concerned me was, do cartoons predict violence, and how concerned should we be when people are depicted, or when you're depicted in cartoons? The real question you want to deal with is I think is why dealing with cartoons? Why look at cartoons at all? Because they seem they're an unusual data set, because they present an incomplete, distorted image of events. First off, they're uninformative. This is actually the first American political cartoon. It says join or die, but it doesn't give you any reason why you should join or die, what you should join or die for. Often people think that's for the American Revolution. That's actually an argument to join the states against a French native coalition, or sort of to join forces against them, that was repurposed for the revolution when the revolution came on. But it doesn't tell you sort of why you should die and what's the consequence for it, or there's no actually reasoning for it. Cartoons are inaccurate, so this is actually a picture of Bibi Netanyahu holding up a wall of Iran and sort of saying thank you to, I suppose, Canada, and Canada somehow blocking it with a bit of maple syrup. So there's actually a little bit of Canadian maple syrup blocking the wall of Iran. This never happened, right? And sort of, but it's an inaccurate depiction of events. And people are distorted, images are distorted, and it's inconclusive. So the cartoons are actually insinuate motive and insinuate consequence, and they're openly offensive. And so cartoons as a data set is interesting because they actually they do everything what you think wrong, basically. But I want to argue the incompleteness of cartoons offers insight into the undercurrents of conflict. It's that incompleteness of it, and there's several reasons for this. Number one, cartoons identify key players in core issues. The fact there's only one image, and the fact there's a limited amount of space. If you make it into a cartoon, it's important. If you don't make it a cartoon, it's indicative of it. This is a cartoon by Bahu Bukhari. I interviewed him. He actually said he was working, I believe it was for Qatar, in Qatar, and he got invited by a government official to talk about his cartoons, and in this conversation he had with this official, he said, well, there's a dinner. He said he was worried because it wasn't so nice a meeting, and he said, but I've never cartooned you. And the message he got was, that's the problem. You're ignoring me and people don't think I'm important. I want you to cartoon me, not negatively, but I want to be included in the cartoons. So the fact that you make it to the cartoon is indicative as well. And sort of reduces the key issues in core events.
Could you just read the caption on the bottom, which we can't see from here?
Sorry. Yes. So this cartoon is by Green, or this caption is cartoons reduce complex situations into a binary class of opposites. So basically what that means is cartoons generally have an us versus them, and they reduce an event into what the key issue is. And again, you usually have one cartoon a day, so what is the issue of the day? And so it reduces it to an us versus them, and you as the reader are often included as the us versus whoever the them are. And so it is a good indicator of the othering and who's the other. The other thing about cartoons is actually they amplify opinion because they can't actually introduce facts or make arguments. So this is a cartoon in 1947 in the sense that the United Nations pays excessive attention to Israel. This is actually the recurrent theme on there. And for people who read cartoons, you don't actually be convinced by it. You're either convinced or you either reject the message or you accept the message, but you don't sway your opinion on there. And the idea is the cartoon actually reinforces, or you don't like the cartoonist, he's wrong. Cartoons reveal speculative sentiment. So what they do is actually, the cartoons actually suggest what people think about without necessarily having facts. This is an Egyptian newspaper, and this actually newspaper got in trouble because they published an image of a doctored image of Mubarak and Obama, and in the doctored image, this is the original image, and they moved Mubarak up here to show that he's the leader and he's walking in front of everybody as opposed to being on the side. And they got in trouble, and the editor said, well, this is an expressionist photo. It's a photo that sort of expresses what really happens as opposed to actually being accurate. And we don't like doctored images. We get bothered if images or videos are doctored because that's not right. Cartoons, to the contrary, completely doctor things. They actually make things up. And so this is a cartoon that was published about the flotilla, and sort of at the bottom, or the basically sort of a ship that sort of came, we were trying to land in Gaza, that was intercepted by the Israelis. Lambs argues or writes that cartoonists distort the news of the day to express what they regard as a truth about someone or something. This is the notion that art lies in order to tell the truth. And if you look at this, right, and if you know sort of, let's say geography, Gaza isn't an island, and it's okay to depict it as an island even though it's not an island, although it may feel like an island. There are no monsters in the Mediterranean, or sea monsters in the Mediterranean. They're not Israeli if they were. And the ship itself wasn't a wooden ship. And so this is completely inaccurate. However, the cartoon allows it to do it because the cartoon actually, we expect cartoons to distort. We don't expect them to represent things as they are, or maybe they do represent as they are. Or as we feel they are. Then cartoons invite action. I think this is the most interesting aspect of cartoons. cartoons take place or are published immediately after an event. So they have usually sort of, several hours after the event, the cartoons are published. And they tend to be pre-climactic the events, they're images of events that have yet to unfold. And often the cartoons itself, they're unfinished stories that you actually complete in your head. But the interesting about it is there is no closure, because closure of a cartoon would render it a comedy or a tragedy. There isn't a closure. The cartoons are open-ended. And much like a horror movie, if you're watching a horror movie and you're seeing they're saying, don't go in there and don't do this, your voice could be heard because the event that you're observing has yet to be completed, so you can actually be or participate. So it actually almost invites action, saying, if I don't like it. And cartoons often have, in most cartoons, there's often like a likely outcome, but there's an outcome that might happen as well, and you can actually possibly take action or do this and will motivate you, saying, that's where the trajectory of where things are going, I may want to change it. And it invites action. I think this is where people get concerned about cartoons, because if they invite action, they may invite violence, they might invite someone to actually do things that we don't want people to do. So the focus of the book and sort of what I wanted to do is sort of given this theory behind it, is do actually cartoons predict violence? And so what I want to do a case study. And my case study was the Second Intifada, or the 2000 Intifada, or 2000 uprising. And what I wanted to do is sort of certain criteria I wanted for choosing case studies. I want something called cross-cultural. I wanted cross-cultural, I wanted different political systems, media regimes, because I wanted to show that if you use cartoons, you can actually see within an autocratic rule versus a democratic rule, whether cartoons would function. Also wanted cross-cultural, so Israeli-Palestinian conflict is interesting because the domestic policy of Israel is important to Palestinians, and the domestic policy of Palestinians are important to Israelis. So what the Israeli housing policy matters to Palestinians, vice versa, and the news items, same events, will affect both communities and be viewed differently. So it had a very nice way to actually do the research. What I also want to do is a rapid transition to violence. I wanted to see if there's a time period where I can show where violence actually occurred, and so things remain basically the same except for a change in opinion or a change in sentiment. So what I chose, the case study I chose was the change from the July 2000 final status negotiation into the collapse of the talks signaled by the election, or the landslide election of Ariel Sharon. And so I have a 6-month window in which I did. And then I wanted to do, so the case study also needed to require a community or a culture that actually liked cartoons. There's a history of cartooning. In Israel, there's a history of cartooning, sort of, I guess, typified in Strulik. Strulik is this Israeli sort of protagonist, which is sort of less popular now, but he still resonates in Israel, and he's been on stamps. And so to quintessize the early Israel, Palestinians have Handele, and so Handele is this a refugee, sort of, it's a personification of a refugee, a boy without shoes, who famously turns his back on the world because the world has ignored him or turned the back on the Palestinians. And so this appears on music, on walls, there's cartoon contests, and there are cartoon exhibits, Strulik. So both communities have a history of cartooning as well, and cartoonings are important. Then the data set I wanted to look at. So what cartoons do I look at? I'm going to try to look at this time period, which cartoons I or study and research. And what I decided to do is, rather than do the 5 to 20% sample, so you got Gerald Tillman say, did you use a 5 to 20% sample? I was wary of that, and so other people have said, so that a selective sample, I'm sort of picking and choosing cartoons that actually may reinforce my opinion or a particular time period. And these, there are books that have written about this. If I want to find extremist cartoons, I can find them and I can say, look at the extremists, there's anti-Semitism, and I find the anti-Semitic cartoons. If I want to look at sort of the anti-Islamic cartoons, I'll actually find those. But I'm more interested in how many cartoons, if there's anti-Semitic cartoons, how many are not anti-Semitic as well. We shouldn't dismiss that as data set to actually say what's going on. Are there, how frequently, how often, which newspapers are more anti-Semitic than others, or more anti-Arab or not than others. And this is actually what I'm interested in. So what I decided to do was look at as many cartoons, or basically all cartoons published in 3 Palestinian newspapers and 3 Israeli newspapers. And the Palestinian papers were chosen because they cover a large segment of at that time, the Palestinian readership. So I did Al-Quds, Al-Ayam, and Al-Ayat al-Jadida, and collectively they're over 90% of the Palestinian population. And the argument of why newspapers is that newspapers itself, when you buy a newspaper, cartoons actually offend people in newspapers, and cartoonists have been fired from newspapers because they have a readership that will sometimes call up and say, you know, I don't like this cartoonist, why is this cartoonist in there? And cartoons will actually move to a line for there, and cartoons actually have some sort of, there's an editorial board that I say you can publish or you can't publish these cartoons, so it does reflect a visible demographic. The three Israeli newspapers I chose was Haaretz, Yedioth Ahronot, and Ma'ariv. And again, this time they cover about 90% of Israeli readership. And this is about 2000. Yedioth had 60%. Haaretz had 20%, or Haaretz had 12%. Ma'ariv at 20%, and Globe at 8%. And these numbers have changed nowadays, but this is sort of the time period. These are the cartoons I looked at.
Is
Yes.
Yedioth free?
Sorry?
Yedioth is free?
No. No, you pay for it. There's Israeli now is free,
Okay.
and you can do that. And that one, in a more recent one, I would actually look at that one there because that has a large segment of the population as
How
well.
have they changed?
Sorry.
How have the percentages changed?
Ma'ariv is less, Yedioth is more, Haaretz is less, and Israeli is basically a free Israeli paper. I think I'll get the number. It's about 30%, I think.
Right or left?
Readership.
Is it-
Sorry.
It's right?
Right. It's more right.
The Jerusalem Post doesn't have cartoons?
I looked at his Hebrew cartoons, so I looked at cartoons written in Hebrew and cartoons written in Arabic, and sort of had to be published within the area. So that was my own limitation in sort of the cartoons I looked at.
The Aliyam, was that started by an American Jewish person?
Alayam?
Yeah.
No, that was the Palestinian newspaper.
No, but there's a free Israeli newspaper, isn't there? Like
Oh yeah, that's today. So the data set I'm looking at is 2000, right? And in 2000, so I'm looking at the data set for
No, I'm
cartoons.
just asking if that free Israeli newspaper was started by an American Jew recently, because I heard about it.
About, I think 5 years ago, I think.
But
So
it's
it's
American Jew.
almost there.
almost 10? Okay,
Really,
right.
that long?
Children adults.
Time goes fast.
Children adults.
What?
Children adults.
The show, no,
Yeah. And there's the cartoons reflected, and newspapers reflect a different demographic. Like you know who the readers of Haaretz are, you know who the readers of Israeli are, and you know those, and they reflect a segment of the population. That's why I want to include them all in there. The coding I use, or how you actually record this or code the cartoons. The first off, cartoons inherently lend themselves to the content analysis. Basically, if you make it in the cartoon, it matters, right? If you're in the cartoon, so what the issue is, if you focus on the economy, and there's more cartoons in the economy matters more. If you focus on conflict matters more. Who's in the cartoon itself is actually an important aspect as well. So the prevalence of an issue or an actor serves as a good indicator of their perceived importance. And I switch importance sort of, my own sort of manifestation of this is the perceived threat. So if you're there and you're the other and you're the one with the gun, you're the biggest threat, and who's the threat that poses to you? Content analysis is useful, but it's limited. Because a content analysis, just because you appear in a cartoon, it matters how you appear as well. So this is Ahmadinejad at the United Nations, and so his size matters. It's important that he's bigger than everybody else, not just that he appears as well. So you need more than just a content analysis to actually understand, and Das argues that the essential feature of cartoons was not what is said, but how it's said. And so you need to actually code for that too and understand that as well.
But the context of that cartoon, I think, is important too.
We're getting there. And context actually comes right after that, right? So you're absolutely right. So as you struggle through this and the coding, you need to say, yes, it's important, but what's going on as well. And so the actual depiction, I like this study, so I just show this. There's a study by Colagero and Mullen who actually measured the size of George Bush's head over his tenure and showed that his head increasingly got smaller in proportion to his body. And so they argue that the Americans perceived him as less intelligent as time went by, and they use as an indicator. But it's important actually, so even changes in how you actually are depicted. The idea, cartoons actually make metaphoric arguments, so you actually understand sort of what things mean. So it's not just that there's a baby here, but that baby represents a Palestinian state, and you have this childbirth, and so this childbirth and negotiation that actually, so things are metaphors for other things. So cartoons actually argue in metaphors, and they draw on metaphors and historical tropes that actually reference. So if you actually, this is just like Munich, we know what that means. This is just like Alice in Wonderland, we know what that means, and it sort of taps into a cultural understanding of it. And sort of how close people are, who's beside each other, what is depicted, how people are depicted, all become important aspect to it. But to speak to the context, actually, an interpretive coding is actually important as well, because it's not just all those alone. You need to understand the context of what's going on. So this is a cartoon that was published, and if you look at this, you have a depiction of Europe looking at a lady who's Jewish, and so the Holocaust is drawing his attention and allows him, sort of for whatever reason, he's ripping out Palestine out of the body politic of the Arab world. And this is an obviously anti-Semitic cartoon, but the context of this publication is important because this cartoon was one of the cartoons published for the Israeli anti-Semitic cartoon contest, and it was published by Jewish cartoonists to show that look how anti-Semitic we can be, and so we're going to use all the anti-Semitic tropes, and it was designed to mock the Iranian cartoon contest. And without knowing the context, you'll misunderstand sort of what the purpose of this cartoon, whether you like it or not, but the intent or purpose of the cartoon. And what you need to understand is beyond just what's in the cartoon. So this is actually one of the cartoons that appeared in the Danish Cartoon controversy. It's important that you know who appears in there, but you also need, so this is actually the cartoon itself actually shows Kari Bluequing, who basically is told is a PR stunt in his head, but unless you know the context, this cartoon was done in response as part of the cartoon contest. If you need to understand sort of culturally, you need to understand what the orange means, and if actually in Denmark, sort of the notion of an orange in a turban means something lucky, something fortunate has happened to you, and this is a lucky stroke. So the orange in his head is a PR stunt that actually benefits the newspaper. And you need to understand sort of cartoon what the readership of children's posting is, and you need to understand sort of what their motivation or sort of who they are in there. And so all this requires, so the coding cartoons is sort of 4-level coding cartoon. You need to know what's going on at the time, as well as you understand sort of the how people are depicted as well. I cover this in my book, sort of each chapter and almost each one. The culture one sort of runs all the way through the book as well. And so some initial findings. So I want to show just some things I found, which I thought is interesting. And this book was very much my test bed of saying, does this work? Does the coding cartoons work? And do cartoons predict something? So I looked at issues of prominence, and if I knew the screen was this big, I would have brought this up. Sort of what appears, so just a content analysis, what appears, are people worried about Jerusalem, people worried about the wall, people are worried about the economy, what are the concerns regarding the conflict? The personified threat. Then I said, well, who's actually personified threats? The cartoons actually personify things. They actually they take an issue and tend to personify it within a person or within an actor, and so this sort of who is the threat that's posed against you. Mood, I looked at mood, and my research now is I'm much more into emotions, like specific emotions, but the mood, is it a positive or a negative thing? So does the cartoon have an upbeat tone or a negative tone to it? And also enemy images. And I use enemy images because there's the literature on enemy images say you worsen if someone's depicted, and there's a range of enemy images. If you're depicted, let's say, an aggressive person with a gun, I can fight you, but sort of you do have some rationality behind your motive. If you are depicted as, I don't know, a barbarian, there's less negotiation. If you're just an animal or vermin, extermination is really the only way. I don't negotiate with a cockroach in my house. I don't say, well, listen, you'll take this part, and sort of I'll take this part. Is that okay? The cockroach will understand it. I have to kill the cockroach. I have to remove the cockroach. And so how you're depicted is an important aspect as well. So some of my findings is who are the biggest threats? And what I did was a grounded approach. I just looked at sort of, anything that was deemed a threat and sort of who is the threat in there. And from the Israeli point of view, you have Palestinian leaders, Israeli leaders, international leaders, and Arab leaders. And sort of these are the ones that were deemed things that threatened Israel or sort of threatened Israeli interests. From the Palestinian point of view, there's Israeli leaders, Arab leaders, international leaders, and Palestinian leaders itself. And when you run through the numbers, Israelis personified threat less than the Palestinians, and sort of I'll walk through it because if you can't see it, but. From the Israeli point of view, Palestinian leaders were a greater threat, although Israeli leaders tend to be also a big threat. There's a sense that, if Israeli leaders just gotten their act together, we can actually deal with some of the issues we're dealing with, and so it's the incompetence of Israeli leaders sometimes that actually cause a threat as opposed to just Palestinian leaders. International leaders and Arab leaders also were far less. From the Palestinian point of view, Israelis or Israeli leaders were the actual biggest overarching threat. That was followed by Arab leaders itself, and then the United States was also a big determinant of it. Palestinian leaders featured far less. There's less of a free press in Palestinian newspapers or dealing with that. So you might argue that depictions of Arab leaders could be sort of substitute for Palestinian leaders, but again, they fell far less than other groups, and Israelis tend to be the most prominent threats. How did Israelis view Palestinians? So I looked at this and I discussed sort of how I come up with this, but this notion that you're either an enemy, you're a negotiator, or you're passive. The passive ways, if I didn't know whether you were for negotiations, so if you're actively engaged in negotiations, if you're actually trying to negotiate something, if you're at a negotiation table, you're a negotiator. Your other side is a negotiator. If you're an enemy, if you actually have a weapon in your hand, you're actually trying to connect violence, you're an enemy. If you're passive, you're just kind of standing there doing nothing, you're neither engaged or interested in diplomacy, or neither engaged or interested in violence. And so the Israelis depicted Palestinians more often as enemies than as negotiators, but when you map it over time, you actually see, so the outbreak of the Intifada takes place end of September, beginning of October, and there's an increase. So with the exception of June, Palestinians are seen as negotiators more often than they were seen as enemies. When the Intifada breaks out, you got a jump in Palestinians viewed as enemies and sort of taper off negotiators. But negotiation sort of tapers off mostly in November, but then it sort of returns to about the same level, and as the enemy sort of dips about January as well. This is like, and sort of depending on whether you have, that's the way it should have worked. If you're an enemy, you want to use force. If you're a negotiator, that actually sort of doesn't show as nice, use diplomacy. So negotiation, I use sort of tough diplomacy. If you're an enemy, I can use force because I have no one to negotiate with. How do Palestinians view Israelis? Again, negotiators 30% of the time, more often than not, 45% of the time is enemies, and is passive, sort of, neither enemies nor negotiators 22% of the time. Again, when you map this over time, you actually see, with the exception of July, Israelis were seen as enemies more often than they were seen as negotiators, and that actually jumps when the outbreak. So what this demonstrates a little bit is that the cartoons actually do reflect what's going on in society as well, but there's also sort of this sort of, anything happens before October was seen as could predict or predictive, saying what's the mood prior to the outbreak of the Intifada. And so what I did was I showed, these were actually just enemy images that appeared, and this is again a grounded approach to this. So I did an aggressor. Every time you had an offensive weapon, if you had a weapon that was sort of an assault rifle, a rocket, anything sort of could propel forward or sort of was seen as an aggressor. And you were seen as sort of rational as a human being. Anytime you're faceless, and so the argument is a faceless enemy is easier to kill. If you're hiding, if your face is masked, if I can't see you, then you're seen as a faceless threat. Anytime you're an animal, anything in the animal kingdom, you're a beast, and so your scenes are easier to kill because, and sort of there's less negotiation. Infanticide is actually an interesting one. Infanticiders tend to be the ones, sort of if you're going to kill children, there's a moral imperative to stop you because you're hurting children. Israelis depicted Palestinians as killers of Palestinian kids, not of Israeli kids. That's sort of putting these Palestinian kids into harm's way or as shields, and so this moral imperative still exists as well, but it's slightly different than the Palestinian depiction or enemy depictions of Israelis. Because this was grounded, meaning sort of I see what's there as opposed to pre-selected categories, you have Palestinians viewing Israelis as aggressors. They're barbarians, so Israelis don't have Palestinians barbarians, but Palestinians have Israelis barbarians. Anything you have like a primitive weapon, your sort of frontal brow is larger. If you look sort of, very like Neanderthalic, that would be a barbarian depiction. Sadists appeared as well. So anybody drinking blood, swimming in blood, reveling in blood, anything sort of regarding sort of this bloodlust was seen as sadists. Faceless threats appeared as well, so again, so the same idea of a faceless threat. This is actually a little boy, sort of a father turning to his son saying, don't worry son, we're not on a foreign planet, we're in Israel, and so everybody has sort of a weapon on their head, or sort of everybody's head is either a tank or a missile or whatnot. And then infanticider, this actually could be coded as a barbarian and infanticider, and this is an Israeli sort of signing a document or signing a negotiation thing with the arm of a Palestinian girl. And so the argument sort of, again, it's the infanticide of things or moral imperative for it. So as I map this out, I want to see how often did enemy images appear. And enemy images appeared more often in Palestinian news cartoons than in Israeli cartoons. And so if you take a look at the numbers, and aggressors, Israelis depicted more often Palestinians as aggressors than in, let's say, infanticiders or as beasts. Palestinians depicted Israelis as aggressors more often, followed by barbarians. Sadists actually did this in order of sort of how often they were depicted on there. And the worse the image is, the more acceptable or necessary violence is, because there's less negotiation once you're dealing with infanticiders and sadists. Because if there's a bloodlust, I can't negotiate a bloodlust. I can't say, well, you can have this many people to kill, but not that many people to kill. When mapped over time, again, sort of what I try to do is how does this change over time? You've got Israeli depictions, and the enemy images jump, so you get to about 33, but the enemy images jump about September, and so there are enemy images that appear, but there's this jump once a violence breaks out, and interesting to me as well, is actually tapers off afterwards. So this fear of sort of this enemy is there, and this prominent enemy, but then it tapers down, and it might be indicative of sort of, a sense of security or sense of it's not as big a threat. Palestinians, enemy images were more prominent prior to the outbreak of the Intifada, and then as the Intifada breaks out, you've got an introduction, so you actually have infanticiders sort of jump and sadists, so they get more extreme as well. So it's not just an increase in overall number, there's a jump in how extreme the actual images appear in there. And so, again, the argument I'm trying to make is that, and sort of, I'll highlight some of the findings, but the argument I'm trying to make is that cartoons, I want to consider cartoons, whether they're it's hard to say, do they predict violence, because you look at cartoons, how often do they, but I like the argument that cartoons are like seismographs of conflict. And so much like a seismograph says, well, the ground is trembling, or we anticipate maybe an earthquake may happen, and sort of it works well with the Intifada metaphor. But the idea that there's this trembling in the ground and things are unstable. If you look at the general one, changes in enemy images and mood accompany shifts in conflict. So as the conflict changes, so do the cartoons. So cartoons do reflect sort of what's going on. Interesting enough, it occurred over very different media regimes. So Palestinian media regime is much more controlled, and sort of things you can't, much more censored. There is censorship in Israeli media regime, but it's much less, and there's a much freer press. But both, the cartoons worked in both regimes, or both media cultures. In Palestinian cartoons, the issues of prominence, so what mattered, changed. So the early sort of during negotiations, Jerusalem featured more prominently. Afterwards, violence and safety appeared more prominently. Enemy depictions preceded the Intifada, so there's which is an interesting aspect of the Palestinian ones, that enemy images were there. I didn't go far back enough yet to actually say, well, when did they start appearing, and was there a time when there were much less? And optimism in Palestinian cartoons accompanied the violence. When violence happened, there was this overall sort of optimistic view of the violence, and this may actually maybe have a breakthrough. And Israel was predominantly blamed for the insecurity felt by Palestinians. Israeli cartoons, the prominence changed with the Intifada. So as the Intifada broke out, the prominence of the issues changed. Enemy images accompanied the Intifada. So as the Intifada broke out, there's an increase in enemy images. There's optimism remained low throughout. So actually, so there's other sort of graphs in the book where optimism throughout. Israelis were neither optimistic for negotiation or for a return to conflict. There was just a pessimistic overall, like they're all seen as negative. They're like picking between I don't want this and I don't want this. And so this sort of reflected, I think, sort of the Israeli mood at the time. And Israeli leaders were blamed often for the insecurity rather than Palestinians. So there were Palestinian Israeli leaders saying, well, if just, let Sahel win, let us, and depending what side you're on, let diplomacy work. You blame your leaders often than you blame for the enemies, which is a different view on there. And so, in summation, I would argue that cartoons chronicle public sentiment, but anticipate policy change or behavior change. And so they become a very interesting thing to look at and research. And so part of my research is I've expanded this. So I have about 1,200 cartoons in there. I'm currently working with 13,000 cartoons, and I'm sort of trying to do a larger set to look for larger trends, and so I want to look at whether it predicts election result victories. I'm looking at terrorism, responses to terrorism. So when the government or the newspaper says this is a terrorist attack, I want to see, do the cartoons mark this as a terrorist attack, or is this just, you know, the government saying it's a terrorist attack? And sort of one sense, sort of what people actually really terrorize or feared by. So there's a lot of work I'm doing, but I want to thank you for your time. I'll take any questions you have. The book is actually, there's a discount for the book there, and you can peruse through the book, but my publisher wants me to show those around a bit. Well, thank you very much for your time.
So I actually have a question on behalf of Professor Nicolini, who's been listening on Skype. He says, in your sense, do cartoons predict or create conflict? If you are right that conflicts consistently precede conflict or their escalation, it is possible that they reflect the state of emotions that will result in an escalation or eruption of conflict. However, it is also possible that they are tools of manipulation of public sentiment.
So I'd say so. I've interviewed some cartoonists. I'd say they don't change opinion. They don't, because again, I've looked at anti-Semitic cartoons, and I'm no more anti-Semitic than I was before, meaning I'm not. But the idea is sort of, you look at cartoon and you don't say, well, oh my God, they're right, the cartoon's right. But what cartoons do, I think, is they allow possibly a hardening, or if there's a debate within society, or if you feel your voice is marginalized. And sort of, Moshe Glidden said that what he likes to do with cartoons is raise a flag for an opinion that actually isn't sort of the popular opinion, but the smaller opinion. He wants to give voice to that. And saying, you know, someone in your community is feeling this way. So often I'll get, because I do this research, I get cartoons, and people send me cartoons often all the time, and they say, look, right, you see? And the cartoons often reflect what their interests are, and even if it's a marginalized opinion, just because somebody else put it down and said it, it may embolden you to act on this, to actually say, you know, I'm not alone in this opinion, right? There's other racists here too. Like I just don't, I'm not allowed to say it, but you know, it's just a cartoon, look at it. And so this idea that it may embolden you and embolden action, yes, I think it does reflect a sentiment, because if you have a cartoon that's so far removed from the set, people would reject the cartoon, just say it doesn't make any sense, or it's just not true, right? Canada being a big, you know, terror threat to the world. If you look at a cartoon on it, you're not going to say, my God, Canada's a terrorist state, because the cartoon told you so. But I think sort of it may embolden, if you have the sentiment in there, it may sort of give voice to minority opinion and have people say, there's a voice in there that I hear. Yes?
All these cartoons are in newspapers, more or less.
Yes, every cartoon used was published in the newspaper.
Okay, now, you like you mentioned the Intifada, the conflict. After you analyze it, when it's all over, it's never all over, as you know, but still. Who does the most lying? I mean, is it if you compare, like, say, Europe, cartoonists, I guess, or newspapers, and North America?
My answer would be all cartoons are lie. All cartoons lie, because they all sort of they distort the truth. But it's a narrative approach. So it's actually I wouldn't say it's actually who says the lying. If you have a narrative, you have to say this is what I think the world's like, and then the cartoons that reinforce your worldview and your sense of it. If you feel that, you know, say Israel's alone and the world's against Israel, our cartoons reflect that. It's not sort of, well, we can look at settings, how many times people vote with Israel, not vote with Israel, sort of how many allies they have or not. But the issue is it's that sentiment. And what I'm actually trying to get at is it doesn't matter, accuracy doesn't matter. People's moods and people's opinions, most people don't know the actual facts. They don't know the level of security, or they don't know, let's say, a terror threat. They feel, they've seen this, they feel that there's terrorists there, so they're going to support policy, or they're going to act on it, and they're not actually looking at the numbers. People are busy, uninterested, and cartoons are very quick sort of say, well, this is the issue. Cartoons are actually very interesting as well, because they actually allow you to sense, even if you don't follow politics very much, they kind of tell you what you should be talking about, what I should be concerned about. The cartoon kind of appears and kind of says, well, that's sort of what's going on, sort of. And Israel, sort of early days of Israel, cartoons actually were often sort of an access point for new immigrants to say a very easy sort of, there's very little writing, or sort of, and I know sort of what I should be concerned, the economy. I got the economy, weather today. There's cartoons on weather in Israeli cartoons past couple of days, and you know it's the weather, right? Sort of, you know, there's a cartoon, sort of Tu B'Shvat cartoon, which is sort of a holiday where you plant trees, and a father's holding an umbrella over a girl who's planting the tree while rain is falling all around, and sort of just this play on the weather matters. Yes.
Thank you for your lucid presentation. There's a tradition, I suppose it's Eastern European, but you find some cartoonists here in North America too, of extremely cryptic messages. Some are extremely difficult to decode. In fact, some relatives would often call me up and say, "What does this Aslan cartoon mean?" In other words, so I'm wondering, my question is, how important is this cryptic tradition in Israeli political culture? I suppose for you that would mean how many of these cartoons were actually so difficult to decode that you had trouble classifying, classifying their intent, or actually classifying what their stand was, which side they were taking, for example.
Yeah, it is a challenge. So there are so first off, the cryptic is actually an important aspect of cartoons. And sort of the story, Moshe Glin approached an Egyptian cartoonist at one point, and he had a discussion. He said, "Why do you always criticize Israel?" This is before sort of the Arab Spring. He said, "What, like, we're friends. You're supposed to be friends with Israel. You're always sort of bashing Israel." He goes, "I'm not bashing Israel. I'm bashing Mubarak. Every time I bash Israel, they know that it's Mubarak, it's just a substitute for it." And sort of people know that these are the codes, and sort of within a community, cartoons are sometimes intentionally cryptic, sometimes non-intentionally cryptic, because it's just sort of, they use metaphors that you understand that other people don't understand, and outsiders will have difficulty, or the connotation. So if I use green, right? Green in Israel, or orange in Israel will be different than orange in Canada. It's not NDP. Israelis aren't talking about the NDP party. In Israel, people wearing orange shirts or wearing bandanas. And so this notion that you have, so this intentional and unintentional thing. Coding, I actually verified. I did coding myself, and then I did coding with an Israeli and Palestinian sit down and say, tell me what's going on. There's one cartoon I couldn't get, which was Sharon turning to Perez and saying, "I'm a loser," right? I'm a loser. And this notion that loser has a connotation in Israel that you say, well, it's why they write it, we're saying in English, right? It's written in Hebrew, but it says loser, and that sort of understanding that loser has a much deeper connotation, and this idea, don't be a sucker, and things like that are important aspects within Israeli political and sort of, a culture that actually matters and needs to be decided, because there's a cultural sort of referencing that actually important. Anytime I was unsure of something, I actually removed it from the data set, and so I did things that are most obvious or most blatant. So I'm probably more conservative than I should have been in the coding, and I've coded with Israelis and Palestinians to make sure sort of, did I miss anything cultural or did I miss anything linguistically as well. But there is going to be that, cartoons intentionally sort of are this cryptic meaning. They're an internal communication, which means the inside joke, so we can be free because we're joking, and the outsider says, "What are you doing?" Like, "No, I'm just kidding," or like, "No, that's not what I meant," and it kind of has this forgiveness.
Thank you.
Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, I don't know. Would you say that cartoons help actually increase people to look at the other side in stereotype way?
There's actually a movement called
So
Cartoon.
if young audience see cartoons, they're establishing kind of stereotype about the others.
I'd say yes, they can, and I think the less interaction you have with an outsider, the more influential any media will be, because I don't actually have any information to tell me differently. On top of that, there's actually a movement called Cartooning for Peace, and there's Israeli Palestinians and also Europeans who are involved, and they're actually deliberately trying to make cartoons about peace or that promote peace, because they feel they can do this and sort of change this stereotype on there. I think the stereotype has to be there, so you actually have to, so you tap into something that's their culture that you can accentuate. But again, it has to resonate. That sentiment has to resonate. There's actually sort of Haaretz in 2000 actually released, there's a press release, sort of, Haaretz actually wrote to its readership that actually says, we're actually taking a more right, we're moving a bit to the right in a reporting of the news because our readers don't believe us anymore. and the sense that sort of this notion that sort of people, you have to sort of tap into what people believe. So you could do anything so extreme like the Americans are, like, you know, if the more interaction you have, the harder it is for it to do. They can actually, I think, harden or soften, and sort of you can do this, but they give permission, if you already have that sentiment, to say other people do it, or makes you feel that you're the only one, and you don't represent sort of, there's nobody supporting your sentiment on it. But I don't think they can change or introduce an idea that isn't already sort of resonant in there. That's why a lot of these motifs or whatever are very culturally resonant.
I actually had several questions, but let's all start with just one or two. What about splitting for each newspaper? How things changed through that time that we're looking at? I mean, Haaretz alone, Yedioth Ahronot alone, not everyone, or perhaps you can actually say that there were times that the three newspapers, let's say, showed the same image through their cartoons about what was happening? Or do you see the diversion between them? Because this is something you didn't present here, and I'm asking on both sides how it works.
Great question on that. Or do you want to take the other ones?
No.
Yeah, first, a great question, and that's actually what I'm working on right now, to actually differentiate them. Also, the number of readership, I don't think maybe I overemphasized it, because I said the larger number of readership you want, but again, a small demographic. So with the Palestinian ones, I missed the Palestinian or the Hamas newspaper, and now on retrospect saying that's important, even though they might have a small readership, they're important as well. Haaretz is also important, even though it has a smaller readership, it's an important one, and actually has a different influence on there. So absolutely, I think differentiating among and sort of understanding the different demographics in there, and I'm doing I'm beginning a work on predicting election results, and I think this is actually very important to actually say sort of which newspaper represents which community within, and there's within Israeli settler newspapers as well, sort of papers sort of, you know, focus on different groups. There's a couple of religious cartoonists that actually have emerged, and sort of they're towing that line, and I think they're important to actually say, giving voice to different communities. So absolutely, I think that's actually the right path to go, and say, how does one newspaper change over time versus the other one, and sort of what I wanted to do here was establish that cartoons can be studied as a large data set, and what can you learn from them as a large data set, and this is actually, so it's the promise of this is just that.
Okay. How many cartoons were not connected at all to the political situation of the Intifada itself, say during that time, on both sides, on each side?
Yeah. More than I expected, right? And the numbers actually, exact numbers in there, more than I expected, which actually sort of when I went there, so I assumed that, you know, it should, you know, it's always about the conflict, always about this, and sort of even this past week, I looked, generally I have to what's going on this past week. People were about the economy, people were about getting into school. Even at this time, there are people like tuition fees are too high among the Palestinians. They're saying it's too high, and it's not always about the conflict. And that's actually an important aspect to say, I'm looking at the so I selected the conflict, but I said this, and it wasn't the majority of them on the conflict. Except when the Intifada broke out, there's this focus on that, but generally, and sort of for good or bad, and even nowadays, the conflict's ignored. Like a lot of the cartoons actually tend to ignore the conflict, which is indicative of the fact that there's a status quo. Let's just kind of leave the status quo, which, if we think it's untenable, it's not going to last. It's troubling that people are ignoring it and not actually dealing with it, but Palestinians are worried about regional issues, about Daesh or ISIS. They're worried about sort of they're you know, the Israelis were about the economy. There's a cartoon about IKEA, where it's an IKEA cartoon that came out. And so these things, like IKEA matters. And so, it's important, but it was informative to say that outside we all say it's a conflict, but there's so much sort of general stuff that's important. But this is actually an indicator. As there's more conflict cartoons rise, says there's something brewing. People are feeling more insecure or more secure. Because I think the more you worry about tuition fees and access to water and things like that, the less the conflict or less insecurity you have, which I think is a good indicator as well. Like, will there be a spark if people don't feel this overriding sense of insecurity, even though we might project it when we look at it. And the media here will often pick up on conflict versus, you know, the tuition fees in Israel, tuition fees in Gaza don't make international news. Yes.
Do cartoonists more often represent their own opinions, or if they don't, how do they become the messenger for the larger community, and how do we distinguish? Is he for himself, or is he talking for the whole community? Like, how do you know?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So cartoonists actually will tend to reflect themselves, and they get hired because people like their message. And so you have Omaya Joha, who's a Palestinian cartoonist, who actually moved from Al-Quds to Al-Lahad Jadida because Al-Quds' readership didn't like her. She was too two on the right, or two, and they didn't like her message, and sort of she moved over. So generally they'll reflect their own opinion, because sort of be true to yourself, but people will buy into it. This is why I actually excluded cartoonists who are freelance or just have a website put up there. I want them to have a community that follows them. And I use a newspaper to show that there's someone paying their bills, and they know that, and if you're not, your cartoon isn't appearing, because sometimes cartoonists will have 2 or 3 cartoonists that submit their cartoon, and the one that appears reflects the line. So you actually may have, so sometimes you just have 8 cartoonists, but you have 3 cartoonists submitted, and the one that best reflects in the newspapers are actually conscious of sort of, you know, they tend to get more backlash from a cartoon than from an opinion piece. There's a cartoon that's offensive, they'll get a call, they'll say, what's this cartoon, what are you doing? And so people tend to care more. So there's a disciplining effect of editorial, and you get paid for the cartoon. Often they have other jobs, so it's not like the end mean. But I think sort of you cartoon what you feel, and then whether you get published or not, is linked there, whether there's an editorial board, and there's a distribution network, and there's actually a readership that you have. I'm toying with the idea, and so I can't figure out how to crack it. The idea is sort of Facebook follows, things like that, like cartoons, so they have that to see how big a readership you have, and also knowing where they are, because you can actually have a like international and sort of how impact, but the readership is important. It's not just a cartoonist, because there are cartoonists who do it, but they don't get published, and so they're individual opinion. But I don't think people go out saying, I'm going to tap in the community finds you, and say, that's exactly what I was feeling. Yes.
Don't you find the cartoons exaggerated?
Exaggerate.
Yeah,
They're exaggerated.
they're exaggerated.
Well, they distort. They actually caricature does that. And my interest in what are they exaggerating? Are they exaggerating sort of, you know, the physical appearance, the stupidity of someone? They're actually they exaggerate. They tend to actually physically distort someone to represent their perceived character. So someone who thinks he's dumb on the inside, I'm going to make them look dumb. Or they're clever or sinister, their eyes are going to get smaller. And so this idea that you try to, you know, put on the outside, physically distort the outside to what's on the inside. But yes, you know, Sharon becomes fatter, or got fatter, and he's just big. But then if you want to show him sort of like immense, that actually says something too. So George Bush's head shrinks, and these things actually matter. But they do exaggerate. But sort of what's the important exaggerate, and what are you exaggerating, and what are you sort of emphasizing on? I think is an important aspect to it. Yes.
There is any code of ethics of what will be the limit that you can say, I can sue you for your cartoon. For example, if could Yitzhak Rabin, Zichrono Livracha, could sue the cartoonist who made him as a Nazi.
There are codes.
There are codes.
Well, they're internal. So I spoke to, let's say, among sort of Palestinian sort of cartoonists. Some would argue when I spoke to them, they avoided anti-Semitic tropes on purpose. They said the most anti-Semitic depictions they did was of Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat usually had the big nose and sort of whatever. They made him look much more anti-Semitic, like the tropes, than they did Israelis, because they said that was a line they would cross for themselves. The same cartoonist told me that his cousin is a member of Hamas, so he said I wouldn't depict like members of Hamas without sort of this consent, because there's repercussions you may have. Israelis will tend to shy away, probably maybe a little bit sort of Holocaust motifs. Sort of you generally won't do it. Either it's a bad taste, or sort of just it's not acceptable. Editorial boards will actually sort of discipline you as well. I don't think it's a legal aspect. I think it's a financial, like you're not getting published. Among the Palestinians is also you could get killed or shot, or if a cartoon doesn't suit favor, like Al-Quds is actually published in Jerusalem, and distribution into the territories is stopped if they don't like what they're depicting. It's sort of like there's actually a point where newspapers like Al-Quds wasn't being distributed because of the cartoons that were published, and they cited bad weather conditions, and sort of it was bad, and there was no weather conditions saying we just can't get through because the weather's bad. So there's a big issue that's going on right now with Hamas and Fatah, and so there's actually the cartoons have polarized a little bit. So Al Ayam isn't distributed in Gaza because they're actually they tend to mock Hamas much more, and so there's a disciplining, and so you may financially saying, if I told the line much more, but then your patron is usually the newspaper that actually pays you, so you actually told that line. Then also there's things that are bad taste for yourself. So some cartoons, so Israelis, distasteful Israelis that don't suit sort of, Al-Quds, right? So so Sharon will sometimes have a green pigmentation to his skin, and that's actually an indicator that I said, you know, why the green skin, why the brown skin? He said, because anybody I don't like, I just put a little green skin on them, right? I just don't like him. So you kind of, and you understand that thing, but it wouldn't be, they avoid sort of, I think, cultural backlash, violence possibly, and economic retribution. I don't think legal is a big issue or a big concern in there, although if your newspaper is going to get sued, then your newspaper is going to say, no, I'm not going to do this, and they're going to discipline you. And sometimes actually, an interesting thing I've been working on is actually the cartoons. I look at what's online and versus what's actually in the newspaper, and I try to find the ones that were censored, or the ones that didn't make it, and I want to know sort of what, again, this is this discrepancy between what they said and what was actually accepted by the newspaper, and I find that interesting as well.
Okay.
Oh,
No, go ahead.
do you get a sense of how social media, internet is affecting the cartoon culture? I mean, we know that all around the world, you know, daily newspapers, printed newspapers are declining. And so, would you get a sense, for example, that cartoons matter less, or they will matter less in the future because of new media?
I actually wrote a paper on this. It's
Okay.
reconsidering the decline of the editorial cartoon. People have been predicting this. I think cartoons are well poised for the digital age because they're very it's like a Twitter, like it just literally is a picture and sort of get a sense of it. Cartoon stuff changed a little bit depending on sort of what I've been also noticing is how often do cartoons, Israeli or Palestinian cartoons, use English. Because if there's an English on there, you know you get a wider audience and people read it, and sometimes actually write things on it. You actually have sort of, Amos Biederman sort of does, he actually is English and Hebrew, and on his English one, he actually has a little explanation of what's going on, like there's an election going on. And so that's obviously, Israelis don't need that, but there's actually this byline that sort of to contextualize what's going on as well. And I think you are conscious of an audience, but also I think the internet is actually, why there's so many controversies now, is because a cartoon passes around sort of networks and all of a sudden saying, my God, look what's going on in the community, I have no idea what's going on, sort of how people are troubled, but that's terrible, and it reinforces more what you as an outsider views or believes about a situation, like Europe is whatever adjective you want to put in there, and the cartoon proves it. I found a cartoon in there, see, that's what I know. Europe is, falling apart, Europe is a light, Europe is doing what it should, whatever it is, you can find a cartoon that reinforces it, and unless you understand literally where the cartoon comes from. So like a lot of the anti-Semitic cartoons actually you can trace, and they usually come from a less dispersed number of Arab newspapers than you'd expect. Syrians feature in there, Lebanese newspapers feature more prominently, and so you can say why those particular newspapers and those particular countries have more sort of, and this is a comparison again, I've got a lot of work to do, so I've got a lot of stuff I want to look at so to figure out this comparison on that as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so first of all, on behalf of all of us here, thank you very much for the presentation. I personally, I found it quite enlightening. Even though I deal with Israel studies all day, to me this was quite different and quite interesting.
Thank you for the questions.
Before I let you all go, we want to also thank Serev Lab that we were able to use today. And let me just tell you a little bit about what they do here so you have an idea. It's a research center that challenges researchers to imagine new kinds of collaboration and experimentation in curatorial work. It was founded to forge new ground in scholarly and public understandings of the aftermath of mass violence. They encourage reconsideration and experimental approaches to ethnography and curatorial practice in light of the particular challenges of violence-related material. It is a laboratory for project-based interdisciplinary public scholarship and a hub for collaboration and research and creative dissemination of new knowledge about experiences of social suffering. If you're interested in what Serev does, they have a sheet to sign in as well if you want to know of their events. We have done some things in collaboration with them in the past. Feel free to put your name and email down. Otherwise, we hope to see you at either the graduate seminars that are coming up. We have 2, and Dr. Rabinovich will also be presenting down the road, so please help yourself to what we have up here, and thank you very much for coming, and hope to see you soon.